A run-and-gun interview is a quick, on-the-fly interview. These work great for interviewing a bunch of different people very quickly, or for interviewing someone who's in a hurry, like the football coach after a game or a teacher in between classes. Let's watch a run-and-gun interview in action. On the right, you'll see the interview happening in real time, and on the left, you'll see what our photographer sees.
Hi, can I ask you a few questions for the school news show?
Sure.
Can you say your name and spell it, please?
Savannah Steffen, Savanna Steffen.
What can you tell us about the food poisoning in the cafeteria?
Well, I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls. Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day. I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital. It's bad news.
As you can see, the run-and-gun interview is quick, sometimes just 1 or 2 questions. From this interview, we've got this one really good soundbite to use in our story.
I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls. Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day. I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital. It's bad news.
Or we could use something as simple as this.
I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital.
Now let's go step by step through the interview process, and we're going to see how it's done. Before you take to the hallways with your camera and your microphone, record a bit of test footage and make sure that your equipment is working.
Check, check, 1, 2, check, check.
The photographer should listen through the headphones to make sure the reporter's microphone is coming through the camera.
Check, check, 1, 2, check, check.
After you've tested the gear, approach your subject and ask for permission.
Hi, can I ask you a few questions for the school news show?
At this point, the photographer is rolling, but hasn't shoved the camera into the subject's face. If they say no, just move on to the next person. Next, the reporter asks the single most important question of the interview.
Can you say your name and spell it, please?
One more time.
Can you say your name and spell it, please?
Before the interview starts, the reporter always needs to ask, "Can you please say your name and spell it?"
Savannah Steffen, Savanna Steffen.
That way, hours later, when you're editing and it comes time to add a lower third, you won't be asking, "Is that Savannah with an A or an AH?" You'll have it recorded right there on the video. You can even ask their grade or their job or whatever information's relevant to your story.
What can you tell us about the food poisoning in the cafeteria?
Well, I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls.
Notice how the microphone is held below the subject's shoulders, and the photographer is doing her best to keep it out of the shot.
Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day. I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital. It's bad news.
Also notice the reporter is holding the microphone. Reporters, never hand the microphone over to your subject. Keep control of the interview by keeping control of the microphone. The photographer is responsible for the look and the sound of the interview. Let's start with the sound, since that's the part that always seems to get messed up. There are 2 things you need to look for. 1, make sure the levels are good. Most cameras show sound levels with a meter that looks like this.
I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls. Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day.
As you can see, this meter is following her voice.
I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital. It's bad news.
If your meter looks like this,
I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls. Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day.
your sound levels are not loud enough. You need to adjust the mic input. If it looks like this, or if it's peeking into the red,
I missed 2 days of school, and one of my friends is in the hospital. It's bad news.
your levels are too loud. Your audio is going to be distorted and it's going to sound awful. You would need to turn the levels down in this case. And when you're in doubt about using a camera's manual audio settings, you're probably best off using the automatic settings for sound. As you're paying attention to the levels, also listen for background noise. Be careful not to conduct your interview in front of noisy appliances like air conditioners or refrigerators.
I heard there was something wrong with the cinnamon rolls. Me and a couple of my friends had them the other day, and I ended up sick, missed 2 days of school. My friend's in the hospital still, so it's bad news.
If you're wearing headphones like you should be, you'll notice these distracting noises and you'll move to a quieter place. In any case, the photographer needs to wear headphones the entire time and listen to the levels and listen for background noise. Now let's take a look at composition. It's also the photographer's job to make sure the shot looks good. There's several things you need to do to have good interview composition. First, make sure your subject's eyes are on third. Their eyes need to be about a third of the way from the top of the frame. No matter if your interview composition is wide, medium, or tight, the eyes should be on third. Here's another example of eyes on third. And another. All right, you get the idea. Here's what you don't want. This feels awkward because Savannah's eyes are framed too high, cutting off the top of her head. You'll want to bring her down in the frame and put her eyes on that upper 1/3 line. And in this shot, she's framed too low. This creates too much space above her head. And this is just about right. Also notice that we can see both of her eyes in the frame and that she's looking at the reporter, not directly into the camera. When a subject looks directly into a camera, it can make your audience feel awkward, like they're looking directly at them. And that's usually not what you want in your news package. And on the other hand, you don't want your subject turned so far away that you can only see the side of their face. We start to lose the detail and the expression in their faces that way. You want to see both of their eyes, and you want their eyes to be a third of the way from the top of the screen. Notice for a second the angle of the camera in relation to our subject. This is a bit more subtle, but you can see the camera is actually eye level. An eye level shot is how we expect to see the world, and it's considered an objective point of view. Here's what I mean. Here's a low angle of the same interview. Savannah appears taller and larger than life. And this is a high angle shot. In this shot, she seems shorter and inferior. A filmmaker might use these high and low angles to make a character appear proud or defeated. But as a journalist, you want to err on the side of objective with eye-level composition for most of your interviews. You also want to remember to give your subject some room in front of them in the composition. We call this talking space. It's sometimes called nose room. Imagine the space in front of the interview filling up with words. This usually means aligning the subject with an imaginary line a third of the way from the right or left side of the screen. This is an example of what you don't want. Notice how this makes you feel claustrophobic. The eyes are on third, but there's not enough talking space. You'll want to move the camera to position your subject along this vertical line. This creates enough talking space in front of them, and it looks a lot better. If the interview were on the other side, you would align the subject with the other line. If you're doing a story with a lot of interviews, think about creating some variety in which direction your subjects are facing. Frame some people on the left side of the screen, some people on the right side. This will give it some visual variety. Or you can use this technique to visually separate people with different viewpoints. If this person thinks the cafeteria food is great, frame them up on one side of the screen. If this person thinks it's terrible, put them on the other side. You can't always control what happens in the background of your interviews, but here are a few basic rules. Try not to interview people in front of windows. A lot of the time, this will backlight them, and it'll make them appear dark in contrast to the bright background. Simply ask if they wouldn't mind swapping you sides and put the window behind the camera, and this will put a lot of that light onto them instead of behind them. If there are legible signs in the background of your shot, chances are your viewers are going to read them, and if they're reading them, they're definitely not paying attention to your story. So try to keep signs out of the background of your shot, especially if they have little or nothing to do with your story. Also be careful not to frame distracting objects behind your subject. This shot has a distracting fan spinning above Savannah's head. In this shot, she appears to have a pole sticking out of her head. Sometimes this can't be avoided, but just do your best to watch out for distracting objects in the background. Did you happen to notice where we did Savannah's interview about food poisoning? The cafeteria. It's the place where the food was actually served. This makes sense for our story. We could have just as easily interviewed her in a classroom or the library or the football field, but it made more sense for our story to do the interview in the cafeteria. So think about that when you're deciding where to do your interviews. If your story was about Mike and him working on his car, maybe it would make sense to interview him with his car and not necessarily in the cafeteria. You get the idea. Remember, using a tripod is always best, but in some run-and-gun situations, it's frequently not possible, and you have to go handheld. Make sure you steady the camera, use 2 hands, or find a pole or something to lean against to help steady your shot. So, if you're a solo operation, if you are reporting and shooting, you're going to have to do all of these jobs at once, including asking the questions as a reporter. In this case, you want to hold the camera as steady as you can with one hand and hold the microphone in the other. Do your best to frame up your shot. You still want eyes on third and talking space, but look past the camera when you ask the questions to your subject. This can be a little tricky, but like anything, you will get better with practice. If you have a wireless microphone, a handy technique is to interview someone while they're performing a task that relates to your story. Like this interview.
So, Tyler, tell us what you're doing today.
Oh, well, we just finished our birdhouse project, so now I gotta clean up. I mean, you gotta put all this wood back here in the box, dust off all these shavings, but it's important to keep a good, clean workspace.
The subject is free to move around and demonstrate how to clean up a shop because he's not attached to the camera by the microphone cable. You'll also find this will put your subject at ease if they can demonstrate something while they're being interviewed. All right, let's review Chapter 2. Run-and-gun interviews are quick, on-the-go interviews, often very short with little or no planning. Always be sure to check your equipment before you take to the hallways. The photographer's job is to make sure the audio levels are correct and that the interview is properly composed. Remember, eyes on third, talking space. Don't frame your shot too high or too low. Watch for distracting visuals and sounds in the background. It's the reporter's job to have a conversation and to never, ever give up their microphone.